The water had gone lukewarm, but I didn't move. My back rested against the porcelain curve of the tub, my knees bent, toes barely breaching the surface. I had turned the lights low, lit a single candle, and let the silence settle over me like a weighted blanket. The hum of the house, the occasional creak of the walls, the distant murmur of a television in the bedroom, all of it faded as my thoughts narrowed into something tighter, more personal, more primal. My hand moved between my legs slowly, the water lapping gently with each motion. It wasn't about fantasy, not really. It was about release, about grounding myself in sensation when the rest of the world felt dull and flat. I let my eyes flutter shut, my breath coming in shallow waves, and I sank deeper into that small pocket of selfish, quiet indulgence. That's when the door opened. I didn't register it right away. There was a shift in the air, the sound of a footstep, and then the soft click of the door closing again. My eyes snapped open, and there she was, standing just inside the bathroom, silhouetted in the low light, barefoot, hair tousled, wearing nothing but an oversized shirt that barely covered the tops of her thighs. Her presence struck me like a jolt of electricity. Every muscle in my body tensed, but my hand didn't stop. It couldn't. Time didn't just slow. It stalled. The steam in the room hung suspended. Her gaze locked with mine, and the look on her face wasn't shock. It wasn't disgust. It was something else entirely. Something unreadable, but piercing. She didn't turn around, didn't apologize. She didn't even flinch. She just stood there, watching, and in that frozen moment, I felt more naked than I ever had before. Not just stripped of clothes, but stripped of pretense, of boundaries, of roles. I was exposed, raw, trembling. I should have pulled the towel over myself. I should have shrunk back, pretended I'd been reaching for soap, done anything to diffuse the impossibility of what was happening. But instead, I let the moment hold. My fingers moved again, slower this time, more deliberate. Not for me anymore. Not entirely. Something in me unfurled, rebellious and wild, as if her gaze had granted permission I never dared ask for. She stepped closer, just once, just enough to fill the narrow space with her scent, warm skin, something herbal from her shampoo, and a trace of whatever lotion she used at night. Her silhouette remained still, but I could feel her breath, shallow, matched with mine. My hand dipped lower, my thighs parting slightly, and a soft sound escaped my lips before I could stop it. I was drowning in her stillness. The heat in my belly coiled tighter, my spine arched against the curve of the tub, and everything in the room vibrated with tension so taut it could slice through bone. When release came, it wasn't quiet. My body convulsed, my mouth parted in a silent cry, and my eyes fluttered shut against the light. I felt the water shift around me, my skin flushed and hypersensitive, every nerve singing. I didn't know if she was still there. I didn't dare look until the last shudder passed and the air returned to my lungs. When I opened my eyes, the door was closed. The candle flickered slightly in the still air, and the water was now cold around my hips. My hand rested on my stomach, fingers damp, trembling. My heart thundered. My skin burned. I wasn't sure what had just happened, not just the act, but the space we'd shared in that charged silence, that gaze, that wordless intrusion. It was more than voyeurism. It was more than coincidence. It was a shift. And I knew, with a certainty that rooted deep in my chest, that nothing would be the same again. She didn't mention it the next day. Neither did I. But something had shifted in the walls between us. It wasn't spoken.
It wasn't even acknowledged through looks or gestures. It lived in the pauses, in the quiet, in the spaces we used to fill with idle conversation that now stretched just a little too long, just a little too loaded. She moved through the house like she always had, calm, collected, barefoot with a cup of tea in hand and hair pulled into a lazy knot, but I felt her presence with a new weight. Every movement she made seemed to draw the air toward her. Every time she entered a room, it felt like something inside me braced.
There were no touches, no glances that lasted too long, at least not obviously, but the proximity became unbearable in its innocence. She would sit beside me on the couch to watch TV, her thigh barely grazing mine, and I'd feel heat bloom beneath my skin like an electric current looking for a place to ground itself. If she passed behind me in the kitchen, I swore I could feel the trace of her body before she even moved. At night, I lay in bed listening for her footsteps down the hall, the creak of floorboards I used to ignore, now sounding like thunder through the silence. Every breath she took in my vicinity seemed louder. Every laugh carried a ripple of danger I couldn't name. I watched her pour cereal into a bowl and felt my stomach tighten. I watched her stretch in the morning, lifting her arms over her head, shirt riding up just enough to expose the soft plane of her lower back, and I had to grip the edge of the table to stay still. My thoughts became a series of vivid flashes I couldn't control. Her wet hair dripping down her collarbone, the way her lips wrapped around the mouth of a bottle, how her fingers curled absently when she read.
My body reacted before my mind could catch up. There was no warning. I'd catch myself daydreaming in the middle of folding laundry, suddenly imagining the weight of her on top of me, the press of her chest, the sound she might make if I traced my tongue along her ribs. I hated myself for it and wanted more. Shame and hunger tangled in me until I didn't know which was stronger. And still, I said nothing, did nothing. I just let the distance between us grow tighter, denser, like a string pulled so taut it could snap from a single breath.
We were still polite. We made small talk, we shared meals, but under it all, I could feel the pulse of that night throbbing like a wound that wouldn't close. Every time I walked into a room and saw her there, something inside me stuttered. I couldn't look at her without remembering the way she watched me in the bathtub. Not just watched, witnessed, saw me in a way no one else ever had, without judgment, without fear. And maybe that was the most terrifying part of it all, how safe I had felt in that moment, even with my body exposed and trembling. There were times when I caught her looking at me, not with overt interest, but with a stillness that suggested more, a quiet measuring, like she was waiting for something, testing the limits, watching to see how far I would go before I looked away. I never did. I always held her gaze until she blinked first, and then I'd retreat to another room, palms sweaty, heart pounding, breath uneven. My husband remained oblivious, or maybe he chose to be. He'd peck my cheek as he left for work, toss a comment about dinner, complain about traffic, and never once noticed the tension humming just beneath the surface. We had become like clockwork, functional, repetitive, predictable, and in that sameness, her chaos bloomed like a vine, wrapping around everything I thought I knew. I craved her without reason, feared her without cause, and still I kept her close. One evening, I found her curled up on the armchair with a blanket, reading, legs tucked under her, tank top loose around her chest. I stood on the hallway longer than I should have, watching her lips move as she mouthed lines silently, her brow furrowed and fought. The way her fingers curled around the spine of the book, the way her breathing deepened when she was immersed. I imagined walking over, kneeling beside her, pressing my face to her thigh, asking without words for something I didn't have the right to ask for. My pulse quickened, and I had to turn away, ashamed of the images crowding my mind. That night, I dreamed of her again. In the dream, we were in the kitchen, and she kissed me suddenly, roughly, pushing me against the fridge. I woke up breathless, soaked in sweat, my body aching with the memory of something that had never happened. My hand moved between my legs, slow and desperate, seeking release that felt less like pleasure and more like punishment. I came quickly, biting the pillow, and then lay in the dark, tears slipping silently from the corners of my eyes. I didn't know who I was anymore. I didn't know what I was becoming. But I couldn't stop, couldn't detach. She was in the fabric of every thought, every breath, every quiet moment I used to spend alone. I could feel myself inching closer to something inevitable, something irreversible. I was standing at the edge of a cliff I didn't remember walking toward. And even as the wind howled below, promising ruin, I couldn't make myself step back. I didn't know if she would push me or catch me, but either way, I was already falling. The heat had been unbearable all day, the kind of thick, breathless humidity that makes everything stick to the skin and turn routine movement into something sensuous by accident. The ceiling fans were spinning lazily, doing little more than circulating warm air, and the house had fallen into a kind of heavy, golden silence. I had taken a shower just to rinse the sweat from my back, tied my hair into a knot at the nape of my neck, and slipped into the thinnest robe I owned, pale silk that clung in places I didn't expect until I caught myself in the mirror. The fabric shimmered like water across my hips. I didn't change. I walked barefoot down the hallway, the floor cool beneath my feet, and entered the kitchen in search of something cold. I opened the freezer, reached into the ice tray, and dropped 2 cubes into a glass. The sound cracked through the quiet like thunder in a cathedral. I poured a finger of vodka over the ice and watched as the clear liquid slid between the cubes, soft clicks rising as they shifted and chilled. I was still standing by the counter, glass in hand, when I felt her presence before I saw her. She entered without a word, without ceremony, but the air moved around her. She had clearly just gotten out of the shower as well. Her damp hair left dark trails along her collarbone, and she wore nothing but a thin, unbuttoned shirt that clung in spots where moisture hadn't yet dried. The shirt was wrinkled, oversized, and gaped at the front, exposing the line between her breasts and the soft dip of her stomach. My fingers tightened around the glass. I told myself not to stare, but my eyes betrayed me. She padded over to the sink, turned on the tap, and filled her glass. The way she lifted it, the curve of her throat as she drank, the way her lips parted just slightly, it was all too much, too slow, too detailed, too intimate. I turned away, pretending to be focused on my drink, but I could feel the silk of my robe stick to the small of my back, my thighs already damp from more than just the heat. The clink of her glass against the counter felt louder than it should have. I moved toward the window, took a sip of the vodka, and let it burn down my throat. I could hear her behind me, the soft swish of her shirt as she moved, the creak of a chair as she sat. I didn't turn around. I just stared out into the late evening light, pretending the outside world could ground me. But I felt her gaze. It slid along my spine like a physical thing. I shifted slightly, letting one side of the robe slip further off my shoulder, exposing skin to the warm air. The silk responded instantly, brushing across my side with a delicate friction that made my nipples tighten. I didn't cover up. I walked slowly to the table, glass in hand, and sat across from her. Our knees almost touched. Her eyes met mine, and for a moment, the silence between us wasn't heavy. It was anticipatory, like an inhale that refused to become an exhale. I took another sip, leaned back slightly in the chair, and felt the coolness of the glass against my fingers, the echo of the ice shifting again as it melted. A drop ran down the side and landed on my thigh. I didn't flinch. I let it slide, watched her watch it. Her eyes followed it downward like it meant something. The light outside was dimming now, fading into that amber blur that comes just before the first stars. I shifted again, letting my leg extend under the table until my toes brushed hers. Just once, just enough. Her eyes flicked down, then up again, but her face remained still, composed. I envied that composure. My own breath was catching in my chest, my skin too aware, my body on edge like it had been set to vibrate under layers of restraint. She finally stood and walked toward the fridge, the fabric of her shirt billowing slightly with her movement. I could see the outline of her hip as she reached up for something on the top shelf. Her spine curved, her shoulder blades shifted, and I watched every muscle, every motion. She turned and leaned against the counter, eating a piece of fruit, maybe melon, maybe something softer, and juice ran down her wrist. She licked it absently. I looked away before I did something I couldn't take back. But the truth was, I already had. In my mind, I'd undressed her 100 times that day alone. I'd pulled the shirt from her shoulders, pressed my face into the curve of her neck, traced her ribs with my tongue. I had imagined her in my bed, in the bath, on her knees. And I hated myself for how easily those images came, how naturally my fingers curled in response, even now, even as we stood in separate corners of the same warm, humming room. I finished the last of my vodka, the glass now warm in my hand, and stood. My knees wobbled just slightly, and I wasn't sure if it was the alcohol or the weight of restraint. I walked toward the sink, brushing past her. My arm touched hers. A moment, a second, but it burned. My silk robe caught on the edge of the counter, pulled tight across my chest before slipping free. I caught her eyes again. No smile, no smirk, just heat, low and slow and waiting. I rinsed the glass. She rinsed hers. I dried my hands on a towel that didn't do anything to stop the shaking. She turned, slow and silent, and left the kitchen, leaving the scent of her damp skin and citrus behind. I stood there, alone again, the echo of her body still tingling in my blood. I stared down at the ice melting in the bottom of the sink, the slow drip of water like time passing in a room that had never felt more full. There was no touch, no kiss, nothing that could be used as proof. But I knew. We were past the point of pretending. There was a line somewhere back there. Maybe it was the night she walked in on me. Maybe it was today in the kitchen. But we had crossed it, silently, together, and I wasn't going to turn back. The sink was full again. Plates from the night before stacked in uneven, careless layers. A wine glass balanced dangerously on the edge. Forks half submerged in lukewarm water. I hadn't bothered with gloves. My hands moved slowly under the tap, scrubbing at a plate that didn't want to come clean, the sponge rough against porcelain, and my fingertips pruned from the water. The house was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of metal on ceramic as I rinsed and set each dish aside. It was late afternoon, light slanting in from the window above the sink, casting shadows that flickered with the movement of my arms. I was tired in a way that wasn't physical, but something deeper, something cellular. Everything I did lately felt layered with tension, even the simplest tasks. My body moved through the motions of daily life, but under the surface, I was pulsing, thinking too much, feeling too much, holding back so tightly I sometimes forgot what it felt like to breathe normally. Every time she entered a room, something inside me tensed, like a bow pulled tight, never loosing its arrow. I heard her footsteps before I saw her. Barefoot, steady, familiar. She stepped into the kitchen behind me, and I didn't turn. I just kept scrubbing, slower now, suddenly too aware of the shape of my body, the way my shirt clung to my lower back, the slight arch in my spine. The air shifted as she moved closer. I could feel her presence like heat radiating off her skin, settling against mine without even touching. The space between us thinned into something dense and electric. She came to stand beside me at the sink, her body just inches from mine, close enough that I could sense the movement of her breath. She picked up a towel, dried a plate I had just rinsed, and said nothing. The silence was full, thick with the echo of all the things we had not said for weeks. The smell of dish soap mixed with the faint scent of her shampoo, and suddenly everything smelled too clean, too sharp, too intimate. I kept my eyes on the water, watching suds swirl down the drain, pretending this was still normal. She reached for another plate. Her arm brushed mine, bare skin to bare skin, just for a moment, but it felt like a match striking against dry wood. I paused, my hands still submerged, and she still too, like we both knew something irreversible was blooming right there between a coffee mug and a butter knife. I turned slightly, only slightly, enough to see her profile. Her gaze was on my hands, not the dishes, not the sink, but my hands, wet and dripping and still. Then she moved. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't hesitant. It was inevitable. She stepped in front of me, slow and smooth, taking the sponge from my fingers, setting it on the edge of the sink. My hands were free now, cold and trembling in the open air. Her eyes found mine, steady and unreadable, and I stood frozen in that moment, breath caught somewhere between fear and want. She reached up, fingers grazing the side of my face, still damp from washing, and she leaned in. The kiss was quiet, not gentle, not soft, but quiet in the way a storm is quiet before it breaks. Her lips met mine with a pressure that didn't ask, didn't wait, didn't apologize. My mouth opened to her instinctively, reflexively, like it had been waiting years for this. Her tongue was warm, tasting faintly of citrus, and I leaned into her before I even realized I had moved. My hands found her waist, pulling her closer, fingers curling into the fabric of her shirt. The edge of the counter pressed into my lower back, anchoring me, grounding me in a moment that felt like it could lift me out of myself entirely. Her body was against mine now, hips pressing, chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The kiss deepened, mouths moving in a rhythm that felt too natural to be new. I could taste her, feel the slide of her lips, the way her breath caught when I bit down gently on her bottom lip. Her hands tangled in my hair, damp strands sticking to her palms, and the sound she made, low, desperate, involuntary, sent a shiver down my spine. The kitchen disappeared. The dishes, the faucet still running, the clink of something slipping into the sink. None of it mattered. There was only the weight of her mouth, the heat of her hands, the press of her thigh between mine. I arched into her, gasping softly as her hand slid under the hem of my shirt, palm flat against my stomach. Her touch was firm, claiming, like she was reading my body with her skin. I tilted my head back against the cabinet door, eyes closed, and let her kiss along my jaw, down the side of my neck. Her breath was warm and fast. Mine was louder than it should have been. She lifted me slightly, enough to perch me against the counter, and stepped between my legs. Her fingers slid higher, brushing the waistband of my shorts. I let my legs part, instinctive and slow, inviting without words. I reached for her shirt, pulling it upward until her skin was beneath my hands, smooth, alive, and humming with heat. I kissed her again, hard, full of everything I hadn't allowed myself to say. The tension that had coiled in me for weeks cracked open like thunder, and I felt myself unraveling into her. Her mouth returned to mine, hungry now, more urgent. My body arched, seeking more, my hands clutching at her back. I could feel the tremor in her thighs, the way her hips pressed into mine like she couldn't help it. The air around us had grown thick, heavy with the scent of sweat and soap and need. I didn't care who might come home. I didn't care about the mess we were making. I didn't care about anything except her hands, her breath, her body against mine. And then, just as suddenly, she pulled back. Not far, not away, but just enough to look at me, to really look. Her lips were red, swollen from kissing, her eyes dark. Her chest rose and fell in rhythm with mine, and the silence returned. This time, not as tension, but as understanding. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Everything that had been denied between us had been spoken through the way our mouths had moved, the way our bodies had responded, the way my fingers still trembled against her ribs. She touched my cheek once more, softly now, and then stepped back. The water was still running. The dishes were still there. My shirt was wrinkled, my lips tingling, my thighs damp with heat. And as she turned and walked out of the kitchen, I knew there was no more pretending. Not after this. Not after her kiss among the dirty dishes. The days that followed blurred together, soft-edged and saturated, like a photograph overexposed by light. Nothing changed outwardly. The routine remained intact. The clink of mugs in the morning, the buzz of the dryer down the hall, the familiar echo of footsteps through the house. But something fundamental beneath it all had shifted. The foundation of what we were, whatever we had been, had cracked open in that kiss, and now I could feel the tremor in everything we touched. She still moved through the house as if it belonged to her, unbothered, unhurried. She wore my shirts without asking, poured my coffee without a word, folded my blanket as though it were hers. Her scent lingered on pillows and behind door frames, clung to the upholstery, soaked into the laundry. And every time I turned a corner and saw her there, legs tucked under her on the couch, head tilted as she read, shirt hanging slightly off one shoulder, I felt something tighten low in my stomach, a pull, a warning, a truth I could no longer tame. We didn't speak about the kiss, not directly, but we also didn't step back. Instead, we moved in closer, orbiting each other with an ease that was terrifying in its intimacy. She would brush past me in the kitchen, and her fingers would graze my wrist. I would hand her a cup, and our hands would linger just a second too long. I started to notice the way her eyes tracked me when I walked across a room, the slow curve of her mouth when she thought I wasn't watching, the quiet shifts in her posture when I stood behind her, those small instinctual acknowledgments that said, I see you, I feel you. At night, we shared the same air. She'd sit on the floor by my side of the bed, thumbing through old books or scrolling on her phone, legs stretched out and bare, hair damp from the shower, her skin glowing faintly in the lamplight. I could feel the heat of her without touching. I could smell the citrus of her shampoo and the faint sweetness of her lotion. Sometimes I lay back against the pillows, pretending to read, but all I saw was her. How her collarbones shifted when she leaned forward, how the muscles in her thighs tensed when she sat up straighter, how her breathing changed when I reached out, absently, to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. There was a night when we watched something mindless on TV, both of us curled on opposite ends of the couch. Our legs met in the middle, tangled like they had nowhere else to be. She had a blanket draped over her lap, and at some point, her foot slid beneath mine, bare skin against bare skin. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just let her rest there, our ankles gently pressing together, pulses syncing like they'd always meant to beat as one. The show ended, but we didn't get up. We stayed like that, suspended in quiet comfort, until the room fell into darkness. I started memorizing the lines of her body in ways I hadn't allowed myself to before. The curve of her spine when she stretched in the morning, the way her ribs flared just slightly when she laughed too hard, the softness of her thighs, the tension in her jaw when she was lost in thought, the flick of her tongue across her lower lip when she was nervous. These details took root in my mind like seeds cracking open in the dark. I carried them with me through the day, tucked between layers of breath and heartbeat, blooming every time she got close. We were too close now, too physically familiar, too emotionally exposed. We had crossed into a territory where even silence felt like a conversation. I could feel her moods without looking. I could predict when she would enter a room. I knew the weight of her footsteps, the shape of her laughter, the exact moment her presence would shift from casual to charged. And she knew me, too. She read me like a second skin, responding to my smallest movements, answering questions I never spoke aloud. There was a kind of safety in the way we existed, but it was laced with danger, too, the kind that came from knowing how easily I could lose myself in her. I had never shared this kind of closeness with anyone, not with my husband, not with old lovers, not even with childhood friends. It was more than intimacy. It was entanglement. Our lives had woven into each other like thread pulled tight in a seam. No longer two pieces, but one shared tension, stretched and stitched by every glance, every breath, every moment we didn't act on the things we wanted. One morning, I caught her looking at me in the mirror as I did my makeup. She didn't say a word. She just leaned against the doorframe, watching, and I felt it again, that burn, that ache, that flood of longing rising like water. I applied my lipstick slower than I needed to, dragging the color across my bottom lip with precision I didn't feel. Her gaze didn't waver. I capped the tube, set it down, and met her eyes through the reflection. Neither of us smiled. Neither of us moved. But everything in me was screaming to close the distance, to drop the act, to fall. We stayed on that edge day after day, the tension becoming a language, the silence becoming a signal. We touched casually, but every brush of skin left a mark. Every shared glance was a door half open. We weren't strangers. We couldn't pretend anymore. The truth was living in our bodies, vibrating under the surface, waiting to be named. I didn't know when the next moment would come, the next kiss, the next collapse, but I knew it would. Because people who are this close don't stay still forever. They burn. The air was thick, the kind of heat that clings to bare skin and makes every breath feel heavier. The ceiling fans spun in slow, lazy circles above us, barely moving the air, just enough to stir the strands of hair stuck to the back of my neck. The curtains were drawn, but a thin ribbon of amber light slipped through the gap, painting a long diagonal across the bed. The room smelled like sleep and sweat, and something sweeter, something distinctly hers. She had started with a kiss, slow and deliberate, like she was rewriting everything I thought I knew about intimacy. Her lips trailed down my chest, her hands guiding my hips to part beneath her. My legs trembled, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of how badly I needed this, how long I had been holding back. My back arched as she moved lower, her mouth tracing a path that made my breath stutter in my throat. I tangled my fingers in the sheets, eyes pressed shut, heart pounding with something deeper than lust, something like surrender. She settled between my thighs, and the first touch of her tongue made my body jerk with a soundless gasp. I bit my lip, trying to stay quiet, trying not to fall apart too quickly, but she knew exactly what she was doing. Every flick, every stroke, Every pause was intentional. Her hands pressed firmly against my thighs, keeping me open, keeping me grounded. I had never felt so exposed, so seen, so utterly at someone's mercy. I opened my eyes briefly, just to prove to myself it was real, and the sight of her, hair falling into her face, shoulders flexing as she moved, sent a fresh wave of heat through me. I moaned her name without meaning to, barely above a whisper, but it filled the room like a confession. My hips lifted off the mattress, chasing every motion of her mouth, and her hands tightened in response, holding me down, holding me together. The edge was close, so close. I could feel the tremor start to build in my abdomen, a low pulse radiating outward, gathering like a storm. I reached down, my fingers brushing her scalp, not guiding her, she didn't need it, but just to feel her, to know she was real, that this was happening. And then the door opened. A soft creak of the handle, a whisper of hinges, a breath of cooler air from the hallway that touched my overheated skin and turned my blood to ice. I froze. She didn't. Her mouth stayed on me, her rhythm unchanged. Only her eyes flicked upward, locking with mine in a question that didn't need to be asked. I turned my head, slowly, terrified. He stood in the doorway. His expression wasn't rage. It wasn't even pain, not yet. It was confusion first, that brief second when the brain hasn't caught up with the body, when eyes are still trying to make sense of what they're seeing. And then, like a wave crashing against the shore, understanding arrived. His face collapsed into something I couldn't name, something between betrayal and disbelief. I didn't cover myself. I didn't scream. I didn't push her away. I lay there, bare, legs open, her mouth still against me, still claiming me, while his gaze burned into the center of it all. His lips parted as if to say something, but nothing came. Just breath, just silence. She paused then, just for a second, her mouth resting soft and still against the most sensitive part of me. Her hands never moved. I didn't look at her. I couldn't. I kept my eyes on him, heart hammering, pulse in my throat, my ears between my legs. I wondered if he could hear it, if he could feel what she was doing to me even from the doorway. He didn't shout. He didn't slam the door. He turned, quietly, walked away like a man in a dream, like his feet were moving before he knew he wanted to go. The door clicked shut behind him, softer than I expected. Only then did I exhale. My body shook, not from pleasure now, but from the aftermath of being seen, truly seen, in the moment of my most private undoing. She looked up at me, her lips glistening, her eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. She crawled up the bed slowly, her body covering mine, her skin flush against my own, and I wrapped my arms around her without a word. We lay there in silence, my heart still racing, hers steady against my chest. The house around us felt too big, too quiet. Somewhere down the hallway, a life we'd built was collapsing. But here, in this bed, in this room, in her arms, something else had taken root. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't beautiful. It was raw, violent in its clarity. I had chosen this. In every way that mattered, I had chosen her. And now the truth had stepped into the light and stared me down. There was no going back. Not to the woman I'd been. Not to the marriage I'd performed. Not to the silence I'd once mistaken for peace. I buried my face in her neck, breathing her in, and felt the weight of everything we'd broken settle over us like a second skin. But beneath it, pulsing and undeniable, was a strange and terrifying sense of freedom.